Case 1. Mitchell Blair, August 2012, May 2013, Wayne County. It was an ordinary Tuesday in the spring of 2015. A crew of eviction workers arrived at a high-rise apartment complex in Detroit's Mack Avenue corridor, tasked with removing the belongings of a tenant who had fallen behind on rent. It was routine work. They had done it dozens of times before. They expected furniture, boxes, maybe some trash that needed hauling out. What they found instead would consume the city of Detroit for years and become one of the most disturbing cases in Wayne County's long and complicated criminal history. Mitchell Blair was 35 years old and the mother of 4 children. She had lived in the Mack Avenue apartment for several years, a woman who, by most neighborhood accounts, kept largely to herself. She was known to be strict with her children. Some neighbors described her as harsh, even fierce. But in a neighborhood where survival required a certain toughness, that observation had not triggered alarm. Children were seen coming and going. Life appeared to continue. But when the eviction crew began removing items from the apartment and came to the large chest freezer sitting in the home, they found that it was sealed and unusually heavy. When they opened it, they discovered what would make headlines across the nation. Inside that freezer, wrapped in plastic bags and taped shut, were the remains of 2 children. A boy and a girl. A 9-year-old and a 13-year-old. They were Stephen Barry and Stoney and Blair, Mitchell's own son and daughter. The children had been dead for years. Investigators descended on the apartment immediately. What they uncovered over the following hours and days was a horror story told in layers, each layer worse than the one before it. Mitchell Blair, when taken into custody, did not deny what she had done. In fact, she confessed with a directness that prosecutors and investigators found as disturbing as the crimes themselves. She was not remorseful in the way the system typically encounters remorse. She was matter-of-fact, explanatory, as though the logic of her actions made sense to her in a way she assumed others would eventually understand. Stephen Barry was 9 years old when he died on August 30th, 2012. He was Mitchell Blair's son from a previous relationship, and according to Blair's own statements to investigators, she had come to believe, or decided to believe, that Stephen and Stoney had sexually abused their younger siblings. This accusation, which was never substantiated, became the framework through which Blair justified what she did to her children. Prosecutors would later argue that the abuse narrative was either a delusion or a deliberate construction, a story Blair told herself and others to rationalize conduct that had no rational justification. What Blair did to Stephen in the weeks and months before his death constitutes some of the most severe child torture documented in Michigan's legal history. Court records detail a campaign of abuse that included severe beatings, burning, and deliberate physical torment. The child was denied basic necessities. He was treated not as a child in need of care, but as a target for punishment. He was 9 years old. He was in the 4th grade. He should have been worried about homework and what was for dinner. Instead, he endured a prolonged ordeal at the hands of the woman who was supposed to protect him, and he died from it in the apartment he shared with his family. After Stephen died, Mitchell Blair did not call emergency services. She did not seek help. She placed his body in a plastic bag, sealed it with tape, and put it in the chest freezer in her apartment. Then she went on living. Her remaining children went on going to school. Life in the apartment on Mack Avenue continued. No one filed a missing persons report for Stephen Barry. His absence from school was apparently not investigated with any urgency. A 9-year-old child vanished from the world, and the world did not notice. It was 9 months later, in May of 2013, that Stoney and Blair died. Stoney was 13 years old, a teenager on the edge of young adulthood. By Mitchell Blair's own account, she strangled and suffocated Stoney, again using the same justification she had applied to Stephen, the same unverified accusation, the same framework of punishment that had somehow, in her mind, justified killing her own daughter. Stoney and Blair was 13 years old when she was murdered. She had her whole life ahead of her. Her body joined her brother's in the freezer. For nearly 2 full years after Stoney's death, Mitchell Blair continued to live in that apartment. Her remaining children lived there too. They ate meals in that kitchen. They walked past that freezer. What those surviving children knew, what they saw, what they were told, those questions would haunt investigators and child welfare advocates for years after the case broke open. On March 24, 2015, When the eviction crew opened that freezer and the truth finally emerged, the city of Detroit went into a state of collective shock. The story was on every local channel, every radio station, every front page. People who had lived near that building tried to reconstruct the years of Mitchell Blair's life since Stephen had died, looking for signs they might have missed. For the most part, there were none, or at least none that anyone had known to look for. Mitchell Blair was arrested and charged with an extraordinary catalog of crimes. 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 2 counts of felony murder, torture, and first-degree child abuse. When the case came before the court, Blair pled guilty. There was no lengthy trial, no competing narratives from attorneys. Blair admitted what she had done. In July of 2015, Wayne County Circuit Court Judge Sheila and Gibson sentenced Mitchell Blair to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was handed down, there was an audible reaction in the courtroom, not just from the gallery, but from seasoned court watchers who covered that building regularly and thought they had seen everything. This case had broken something in the ordinary rhythm of the justice system. It had required people to look directly at a thing they would rather not know existed. There is a detail in this case that investigators and court reporters have returned to repeatedly in the years since. It is not the freezer, not the confession, not the courtroom. It is a smaller thing. Stephen Barry was 9 years old when he disappeared from his school, from his neighborhood, from his life. In a functioning protective system, a 9-year-old who stops showing up to school triggers phone calls, home visits, welfare checks. Someone notices. Someone asks. In Stephen's case, that did not happen in time. He was already gone, sealed in a freezer in his own home, before the machinery of protective systems ever turned its attention his way. Mitchell Blair will die in prison. Stephen Barry and Stoney and Blair are gone. They were 9 years old and 13 years old. They deserved so much more than they received, and they deserved far better than the mother fate assigned them. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to coldYtub. Every notification brings these stories to someone who needs to hear them. Case 2. Justine Johnson, September 2021, Iosco County. 2 days. It had been exactly 2 days since Sutton Marie Mosser celebrated her 3rd birthday, when her mother, Justine Johnson, took her daughter's life inside their home in Oscoda Township, a small community in Iosco County in Michigan's northeastern Lower Peninsula. Sutton had just turned 3. She had just had a birthday. She was at the age when children start asking why about everything, when they begin to discover the pure delight of running and jumping and making up games, when the world opens up into something full of color and wonder and possibility. She never made it to 3 years and 3 days old. On September 16, 2021, emergency services were called to a residence in Oscoda Township. When officers and paramedics arrived, they found Sutton Mosser with multiple stab wounds. Despite emergency efforts, the child died. She had been stabbed 17 times. 17 times. A 3-year-old child. 2 days after her birthday, Justine Johnson was taken into custody almost immediately. What investigators learned in the hours and days after the crime defied easy categorization. Johnson gave a statement that was, in the clinical language of police reports, extremely disturbing. She told investigators that while she was watching television, a children's cartoon was playing in the background. She heard a voice telling her that she had to kill Sutton or she herself would be killed. She described the command as clear, as certain, as something she felt compelled to obey. Johnson had a documented history of mental health struggles. She had been prescribed medication and had, in the period leading up to Sutton's death, stopped taking it. She had also been using methamphetamine and heroin, substances that, in combination with untreated mental illness, can produce states of psychosis that investigators and psychiatrists would reference extensively in the legal proceedings that followed. But here is where this case becomes legally and ethically complicated in ways that Michigan courts would spend the next year and a half working through. The question of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the rights of a 3-year-old child who had no ability to protect herself from any of it. Justine Johnson was charged with homicide, felony murder, and first-degree child abuse. The charges carried mandatory life sentences. Her defense pointed to her mental health history, to the documented psychosis, to the evidence that she had been in a profoundly altered mental state. Prosecutors, meanwhile, focused on Sutton, on the 17 stab wounds, on the child's complete vulnerability, on the state's obligation to hold accountable anyone who takes the life of a child regardless of the internal circumstances of their own mind. On March 27, 2023, approximately 18 months after Sutton's death, Justine Johnson pled guilty to first-degree felony murder and first-degree child abuse. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Iosco County, a small and relatively quiet community far from the metropolitan centers where these cases more typically make regional headlines, Sutton Moster's death hit with the particular weight that only comes when tragedy strikes somewhere people consider safe. Iosco Township is not a large city. It is a place where people know their neighbors, where communities are small enough that a child's absence registers quickly. And yet none of that proximity, none of that smallness, prevented what happened to Sutton. The questions that Justine Johnson's case raises are not simple ones. The intersection of severe mental illness, substance abuse, poverty, and child safety is one of the most pressing and chronically under-resourced challenges in American public health. Sutton Moster did not have the ability to navigate any of that complexity. She was 3 years old. She needed protection that was not provided. What is not complicated, in this case or any other in tonight's documentary, is this: Sutton Marie Moster deserved to see her 4th birthday. She deserved to go to preschool and learn her letters and ask why until the adults around her ran out of answers. She deserved a long, ordinary, unremarkable childhood filled with the kinds of experiences that most of us barely remember because they were so consistently, comfortably normal. She did not get any of those things. Justine Johnson will spend the rest of her life in a Michigan state prison. Sutton Marie Moster's life lasted 3 years and 2 days. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to coldYtub. It helps us keep telling the stories that matter. Case 3. Amanda Maison, February 2018, St. Clair County. Sometimes the most chilling element of a true crime case is not the crime itself, as horrifying as the crime may be, but the silence that follows it. The years of ordinary life that stack up on top of a secret. The calendars that keep turning, the seasons that keep cycling, the small daily rituals of existence that continue uninterrupted while somewhere, in the deep architecture of an unsolved case, the truth sits and waits. Matthew Maison was 3 years old when he died on February 18, 2018, in Port Huron Township in St. Clair County, Michigan. He was found unresponsive in his bed. By the time anyone arrived to help, it was already too late. The medical examiner's findings were devastating: blunt force trauma to the head, with features consistent with asphyxiation. He was 3 years old. For 7 years, the full truth of what happened to Matthew Maison was not reflected in any criminal charge. There were investigations. There were questions. There was, presumably, the kind of quiet internal pressure that investigators carry when a case remains open and a child's death remains officially unaccounted for. But for 7 years, no one was charged with killing Matthew. Then, in April of 2025, St. Clair County prosecutors made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the community. Amanda Maison, Matthew's own mother, was being charged with first-degree murder in connection with her son's death. Her then-boyfriend, Maurice Howell, was charged in the same period. The story that prosecutors laid out in their charging documents was one of deliberate cruelty with a calculated motive. According to the prosecution's account, Matthew was in Amanda Maison's way. She had a new relationship with Howell, and the child, her own child, her 3-year-old son, was perceived as an obstacle to that relationship. Investigators alleged that the abuse Matthew endured in the final weeks of his life was sustained and severe, not the product of a single moment of violence, but of a pattern of deliberate harm inflicted by the people responsible for keeping him safe. Amanda Maison pled guilty to second-degree murder in November of 2025. In the course of those proceedings, she admitted to pushing Matthew's head into a wall during what she described, in language that prosecutors found as infuriating as it was revealing, as a military timeout. She admitted to concealing the abuse. She admitted to allowing a pattern of harm to continue unaddressed and unreported. The concept of a military timeout as framing for killing a 3-year-old child is the kind of language that prosecutors, journalists, and advocates remember long after a case has concluded. It is an attempt to normalize violence by applying a quasi-disciplinary vocabulary to it, to make brutality sound like structure, to make cruelty sound like parenting. Matthew Maison's head was slammed into a wall. There is no terminology that changes what that was. Maurice Howell's proceedings remained ongoing at the time this documentary was produced. The full picture of what happened to Matthew in those final days and weeks continues to emerge through the St. Clair County court system. What is fully clear is this. Matthew Maison was 3 years old. He was living in a home where the people responsible for him had decided, in whatever algebra of self-interest and dysfunction they were operating from, that his needs were less important than their own desires. He was hurt, repeatedly, and he did not survive it. And then the accountability that his death demanded did not come for 7 years. The 7-year gap between Matthew's death and Amanda Maison's charges is not only a prosecutorial matter. It is a question about what happens when the adults in a room are the only witnesses to what happened inside it, and all of them have reasons to stay quiet. It is a question communities across Michigan and across the country must keep asking. Amanda Maison is awaiting sentencing. Matthew Maison was 3 years old. He will never be any older. Don't forget to like and subscribe to coldYtub. Your support helps us bring attention to cases like Matthew's. Case 4. Tatiana Fusari, August 2018, Kent County. Mary Welch was 10 months old on August 2, 2018. She was, in terms of human development, barely at the stage where the world becomes real in a sustained way, where faces become familiar, where sounds become recognizable, where the first tentative reaches toward independence begin to emerge. She was a baby in the most complete sense of the word. Entirely, utterly dependent on the adults in her life for everything. For food, for water, for warmth, for medical care, for survival itself. She received none of those things adequately in the weeks before she died. In Solon Township, a small community in Kent County in western Michigan, Mary Welch died from severe malnutrition and dehydration. When medical personnel examined her, the findings were stark and unambiguous. This child had not been adequately fed or hydrated for a significant period before her death. She had not received medical care despite being severely, visibly ill. She was 10 months old, and she had been failed by every adult in her life so completely, so continuously, that her body simply gave out. Mary's parents were Tatiana Fusari and Seth Welch. Both were charged in connection with her death. This documentary focuses on Fusari, but to understand what happened to Mary, both parents' roles must be examined together because the defense they offered was shared. They had refused to seek medical care for their daughter because of their religious beliefs. They believed in the power of prayer as a substitute for medicine. They believed that seeking conventional medical treatment would represent a failure of faith. And so they watched their 10-month-old daughter deteriorate across the span of days and weeks, and each day they chose prayer over a phone call to a pediatrician. In the legal system of the state of Michigan, that choice constitutes murder. The distinction between sincere religious belief and criminal child neglect is one that courts have grappled with for decades across this country. Michigan law does not provide an exemption from criminal child abuse and murder statutes based on religious motivation. The law is clear. Parents are legally obligated to provide their minor children with necessary medical care, and the failure to do so, when that failure results in serious harm or death, is a crime. The sincerity of the belief, however profound and however genuine in the minds of those who hold it, does not change the outcome for the child. Mary Welch did not choose her parents' religious convictions. She had no say in whether medical care would be sought for her. She was 10 months old, and she was dying in a home where the adults around her believed that prayer was enough. It was not enough. Tatiana Fusari's legal proceedings were extended and complicated. She initially entered a no-contest plea, then withdrew it. The case proceeded to a full jury trial in Kent County. The evidence presented to that jury included medical testimony about the state of Mary's body at the time of death, the signs of prolonged malnutrition, the markers of dehydration, the clinical indicators that physicians testified would have been clearly visible to any attentive caretaker across the weeks before August 2nd. The jury heard about the parents' own accounts of what they had observed in their daughter's declining condition, and about their decision, maintained throughout that entire deteriorating period, not to pick up the phone and call a doctor. The jury convicted Tatiana Fusari of first-degree murder, not second-degree, not manslaughter, not a lesser charge reflecting diminished culpability. First-degree murder. carrying the mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In November of 2021, that sentence was imposed. The child welfare professionals and legal advocates who follow cases of medical neglect often note the particular horror of this category of crime because of its duration. A 10-month-old child dying from starvation does not die in a single terrible moment. It is a process measured in days and weeks. There are signs along the way, visible, observable, undeniable signs of a child in serious distress. The parents in this case saw those signs repeatedly, across that entire span of time, and made a choice, not once but over and over again, to do nothing beyond pray. Each day they maintained that choice was another day Mary Welch did not receive the help that could have saved her. Mary Welch was 10 months old. She had not yet had her first birthday. In the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary life, she would have taken her first steps in the months after August 2nd, 2018. She would have said her first real words. She would have begun to become the person she was going to be. Her laugh would have become recognizable. Her personality would have become its own distinct thing. None of that happened because the people responsible for her survival chose their beliefs over her life. Tatiana Fusari will die in prison. Mary Welch was 10 months old. Please like this video and subscribe to coldYtub. Together we make sure these children are never forgotten. Case 5. Azuradee, France, March 2022, Wayne County. There is a cruelty that operates in silence. That does not announce itself. That leaves no visible trail in the street or in the neighborhood or in the daily pattern of an ordinary block in an ordinary city. It happens behind closed doors, in the interior of homes where a child's cries go unheard by anyone who could help. And it ends the way it always ends when no one intervenes, with a child who is no longer alive, and a secret that the person responsible hopes will stay buried. Azuradee, France hoped her secret would stay buried in a freezer. Chas Allen was 3 years old. He was also blind, a child navigating the world without the ability to see the faces of the people around him, dependent on sound and touch and the presence of the adults in his life in ways that made his vulnerability even more complete than that of other toddlers his age. He deserved exceptional care. He received the opposite. Prosecutors established that Chas was killed in March of 2022 inside the Detroit home where he lived with Azuradee, France. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, severe physical abuse that left injuries inconsistent with any accident and consistent only with deliberate, violent assault. Chas was 3 years old and blind, and he was beaten until he died. What followed his death was an attempt at concealment that echoed, in its method if not its scale, the case of Mitchelle Blair from years earlier. Azuradee, France placed Chas's body in a basement freezer. She went on living. The days continued. June arrived, bringing with it the ordinary rhythms of summer in Detroit, heat and noise and the sounds of a city in motion. And somewhere in a basement on a street in Wayne County, a 3-year-old boy who had been blind and helpless and entirely dependent lay sealed in a freezer, waiting for someone to find him. On June 24th, 2022, nearly 3 months after Chas died, his remains were discovered. The investigation that followed produced charges of felony murder, first-degree child abuse, torture, and concealment of a death. The evidence compiled by Wayne County prosecutors painted a picture of sustained abuse leading to a violent death, followed by a calculated attempt to make a child disappear. In July of 2024, Azuradee, France pled guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 35 to 60 years in prison, a substantial sentence that, depending on parole decisions, could mean that France spends the remainder of her functional adult life behind bars. There is a dimension to Chas Allen's story that demands particular attention, and it is this: he was blind. In the hierarchy of vulnerability that runs through all of these cases, and all of these children were profoundly vulnerable, Chas occupied an extreme position. He could not see the threat coming. He could not read the expressions of the adults around him, could not use visual cues to navigate danger, could not do the small instinctive things that sighted children sometimes do in dangerous environments. He was dependent on Azuradee, France, not just as his caregiver, but as his primary interpreter of the physical world. And she used that dependence not to protect him, but to harm him. The advocates who work with children who have disabilities and who are also at risk of abuse have long argued that disabled children face disproportionate rates of abuse and neglect. They have also long argued that the systems designed to protect children are not adequately equipped to identify abuse in households where children have disabilities, particularly disabilities like blindness that affect how children communicate distress. Chas Allen's case is a devastating piece of evidence in support of both of those arguments. Azuradee, France, is serving her sentence in a Michigan State Correctional Facility. Chas Allen was 3 years old. He was blind. He needed someone to protect him, and the person he needed most was the person who killed him. If you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to coldYtub. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to the mission of this channel. Case 6. Chelsea Renee Duperon, March 2024, Wayne County. Lila Castle was 8 years old. She was the age when children are fully formed little people, when they have best friends and favorite subjects and opinions about things, when they can read chapter books and ride bikes, and tell you exactly what they think about dinner. She was 8, which means she had been in school for several years, had teachers who knew her name, had classmates who sat next to her every day. She was not invisible. She was a person in the world in a way that very young children are not yet fully able to be. And yet she died from injuries so severe that prosecutors who reviewed the autopsy report described it as among the most extreme physical abuse documentation they had encountered in their careers. On March 13, 2024, Lila Castle was beaten inside the home she shared with Chelsea Renee Duperon in the city of Wayne, in Wayne County, Michigan. Police were called on March 16, 3 days later. By the time they arrived, Lila was in critical condition. She was transported to a hospital, where she was pronounced dead. The medical examination that followed was, by every account of those who reviewed its findings, horrifying. The autopsy revealed that there was not a single part of Lila's body, from the top of her head to the soles of her feet, that was free of bruising. Her injuries were not the product of a single episode of violence, as catastrophic as that violence had been. They indicated a pattern, a history of physical harm that had been building and escalating over time. She had suffered what medical examiners described as catastrophic blunt force trauma to the head and face, injuries of the kind that result from severe, repeated, forceful impact. She was 8 years old. Chelsea Renee Duperon, when confronted by investigators, offered an explanation that prosecutors described as both implausible and revealing. She claimed that bad spirits were responsible for Lila's injuries. She referenced a mysterious woman who had, in her telling, caused the harm. The investigation found no evidence to support any version of events that did not place the source of Lila's injuries squarely within the home she shared with Duperon. The charges filed against Chelsea Renee Duperon included felony murder and first-degree child abuse, charges that reflected the severity of what prosecutors believe the evidence demonstrated. In July of 2025, Duperon pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 28 to 50 years in prison. Depending on parole decisions, she may be in her 70s or older before she has any possibility of release. There is something that must be said about Lila Castle's visibility, about the fact that she was 8 years old and in school and known to people outside her home, and about what that visibility did and did not accomplish for her protection. The systems that are supposed to identify children who are being harmed at home depend significantly on the observations of teachers, school counselors, coaches, neighbors, and other adults who interact with children regularly. These systems are imperfect. They are underfunded. They are staffed by people who are often overloaded and who face genuine institutional barriers to taking action based on concern alone. But they exist precisely because children like Lila Castle deserve someone in their daily environment who is paying attention. Whether those systems failed Lila, whether there were signs that went unreported or concerns that went unacted upon, is a question that the community of Wayne, Michigan was left to grapple with after her death. It is a question without a comfortable answer. What is certain is that Lila Castle was 8 years old. She had been alive long enough to know who she was, to have started becoming the person she was going to grow into. That person was taken from her, taken from everyone who knew her, by the person she was supposed to be safest with. Chelsea Renee Duperon is serving her sentence. Lila Castle is gone. Don't forget to like and subscribe to coldYtub. Every subscriber helps these stories reach someone who needed to hear them. Case 7. Brandee Katrice Pierce, October 2024, Wayne County. 6 months before Zemar King was killed, he told someone. That detail, That single, staggering fact sits at the center of this case like a stone that cannot be moved or ignored. 6 months before 9-year-old Zemar King was smothered to death in a Detroit home and buried in the backyard, he had reported to Child Protective Services that his mother choked him and that she wanted to kill him. He said those words to someone whose job it was to protect children. He named his abuser. He identified the threat. He was not removed from the home. On October 24, 2024, Zemar King was 9 years old, and he was murdered by his mother, Brandee Katrice Pierce. Investigators determined that Pierce smothered her son, that she cut off his air until he was gone, until the 9-year-old boy who had told a caseworker 6 months earlier that his mother wanted to kill him was no longer alive to tell anyone anything at all. What happened after Zemar's death extended the horror of what had already been done. Pierce did not call emergency services. She did not attempt to get help. Instead, she took her son's body and buried it in the backyard of a residence, concealing him in a shallow grave in the earth, as though 9 years of a child's life could be covered over with dirt and made to disappear. The investigation that led to the discovery of Zemar's remains began as a missing child inquiry. When a 9-year-old does not appear at school, when a 9-year-old is not seen in a neighborhood, when a 9-year-old seems to have simply vanished from the daily rhythms of existence, someone eventually asks where he is. The asking came. The searching came. On January 6, 2025, more than 2 months after Zemar was killed, his body was found buried in that backyard in Detroit. Brandee Katrice Pierce was charged with first-degree murder, felony murder, first-degree child abuse, tampering with evidence, and concealment of a death. The charges represented the full weight of what investigators believe the evidence documented: a premeditated killing, the murder of a child, followed by a deliberate attempt to hide what had been done. Pierce's case was pending trial at the time this documentary was produced. The legal proceedings were ongoing in Wayne County. But the legal proceedings are not the only story here. The other story, the one that child welfare advocates, educators, social workers, and every parent who hears this case will not be able to let go of, is the CPS report. Zemar King, at 9 years old, did what children who are being abused are told to do. He told an adult. He told an adult whose institutional purpose was specifically to respond to exactly what he was reporting. And he was left in place. He stayed in the home where, 6 months later, his mother would kill him. The system that was supposed to save Zemar King failed him. That failure is not a marginal detail of this case. It is the case. It is the reason that Zemar King, who was brave enough to ask for help, is no longer alive to receive it. In the city of Detroit, in the shadow of that failure, Zemar King was 9 years old. He had a voice. He used it. He deserved to have someone listen. Please like this video and subscribe to coldYtub, because stories like Zemar's need to be heard by as many people as possible. Case 8. Cortney Bartholomew, November 2025, Wexford County. This is the newest case in tonight's documentary, and it is still unfolding. The trial has not yet been held. The full evidence has not yet been presented to a jury. But the facts that prosecutors have already laid before the court, the facts that are already part of the public record in Wexford County, Michigan, are so extreme, so deeply disturbing, that to omit this case from any serious examination of the worst acts of violence committed against children and families in the state of Michigan would be a failure of honest storytelling. Cortney Bartholomew is the biological mother of Rebecca Park. Rebecca was 22 years old and approximately 38 weeks pregnant, days away from giving birth to a baby that was, by every medical measure, fully formed and ready for the world, when she disappeared on November 3, 2025. Rebecca had been adopted as an infant and raised by another family. Her biological mother, Cortney Bartholomew, had come back into her life as an adult. What prosecutors allege happened next is among the most chilling things documented in Michigan's recent criminal history. According to prosecutors, Cortney Bartholomew and her husband Brad Bartholomew lured Rebecca Park to their home in Boone, in Wexford County. What happened inside that home on November 3, 2025, what was done to a 22-year-old woman who was days from delivering her baby, resulted in Rebecca's death and the death of her unborn child. Rebecca's remains were found on November 25, 2025, in the Manistee National Forest. She had been there for more than 3 weeks. The charges brought against Cortney Bartholomew are among the most severe that Michigan's criminal code provides. She was charged with first-degree murder, felony murder, torture, conspiracy to commit torture, assault on a pregnant individual causing miscarriage or stillbirth, unlawful imprisonment, and removal of a body from a death scene. Brad Bartholomew was charged alongside her. Both were denied bond. Both were held awaiting trial. The element of this case that makes it almost impossible to process. That makes it the kind of case even experienced prosecutors and investigators describe as uniquely disturbing, is the specific nature of the relationship between perpetrator and victim. Rebecca Park was Cortney Bartholomew's daughter, her biological daughter, the woman who gave her life. The connection between a mother and the child she carried is, in the grammar of human relationships, one of the most fundamental that exists. Cortney Bartholomew did not protect that connection. She weaponized it. She used the trust that comes with that bond, the particular trust a young woman might extend to a biological parent she had sought out or reconnected with, to bring Rebecca into a situation from which she could not escape. And Rebecca was not just 22 years old. She was 38 weeks pregnant. She was carrying a child of her own. She was days away from becoming a mother herself, from establishing the very bond that Bartholomew had so catastrophically violated. 2 lives ended in Wexford County on November 3, 2025. A daughter and a grandchild. Cortney Bartholomew's trial was pending in Wexford County at the time this documentary was produced. The full weight of the evidence against her will be tested in a court of law. What has already been established in the public record is enough to ensure that this case will be remembered as one of the most devastating acts of maternal betrayal in the history of this state. Rebecca Park was 22 years old. Her baby was never born. They deserved more than the world gave them. If this case affected you, please like and subscribe to coldYtub. Your support keeps this channel going and keeps these stories in the conversation. Case 9. Kimora Hodges, June 2022, Macomb County. Katrice Starks was 22 months old. Not yet 2 years old. Still in the stage of babyhood that parents describe as that breathtaking window when a child is becoming themselves, day by day, word by word, step by step. He had been alive long enough to have a personality, to recognize faces, to prefer certain things over others, to laugh in a way that was distinctly his own. He had not been alive long enough to be safe in the care of someone who meant him harm. On June 13, 2022, Katrice Starks died in Roseville, Macomb County, Michigan. He was in the care of Kimora Hodges, a neighbor who had been trusted with his supervision. He had been left with her as a babysitter, the kind of ordinary arrangement that families make constantly, the kind of arrangement built entirely on the assumption that the person watching your child will keep them safe. When medical examiners conducted their examination of Katrice Starks, the findings were unambiguous and devastating. The 22-month-old had suffered fatal brain trauma caused by violent physical abuse. The injuries were not the result of an accident. They were not the consequence of a fall or a mishap or any of the ordinary physical mishaps that befall toddlers in the course of their energetic, stumbling, joyful exploration of the world. They were the result of deliberate violence inflicted upon a child who weighed perhaps 20 pounds and stood perhaps 30 inches tall, a child who had no capacity to defend himself. Kimora Hodges was charged with felony murder and first-degree child abuse. The case proceeded to a full jury trial in Macomb County. Prosecutors presented the medical evidence, the timeline, and the specific findings of the examination that established both the nature of Katrice's injuries and their cause. The jury heard the evidence. The jury deliberated. On July 31, 2025, 3 years after Katrice's death, Kimora Hodges was convicted of felony murder and first-degree child abuse. On November 4, 2025, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 15 to 40 years on the child abuse conviction. A note on Kimora Hodges' inclusion in this documentary. She was not Katrice Starks' biological mother. She was a neighbor, a babysitter, a person trusted with his care. That distinction is factually accurate, and it matters. But the role she occupied in Katrice's life at the moment of his death, the person responsible for him, the person who held his safety in her hands, is the role that every case in this documentary has examined. The betrayal of that responsibility, the violence done to a child who had every right to expect protection, is what places her case alongside the others in tonight's program. There is also this. The families who trust their children to the care of others are making an act of profound vulnerability. They are saying, implicitly, that they believe this person is safe. The family of Katrice Starks trusted that Kimora Hodges was safe. They left their 22-month-old son in her care. They came back to find their child dying. The weight of that, the specific, irreversible, life-altering weight of learning that the person you trusted has destroyed the most precious thing in your world, is something no sentence of a court can fully address. Kimora Hodges was convicted. She was sentenced to life. But Katrice Starks was 22 months old, and the people who loved him have to carry that weight forever. Kimora Hodges is serving her sentence. Katrice Starks deserved to see his second birthday. Don't forget to like and subscribe to coldYtub. It only takes a second, and it helps us keep telling the stories of children who can no longer speak for themselves. Case 10. Shanda Vander Ark, July 2022, Muskegon County. Timothy Ferguson was 15 years old, and he weighed 69 pounds. Let that number sit for a moment. 69 pounds. A 15-year-old boy. The average 15-year-old male in the United States weighs approximately 125 pounds. Timothy Ferguson, at 15, weighed 69. The judge who sentenced his mother would later describe what he had seen in the photographs and medical documentation from this case as resembling images from a Nazi concentration camp. That comparison, devastating, extreme, and deliberately chosen, was not made for effect. It was made because the judge, a man who had spent his career in courtrooms and had seen the photographic documentation of serious crimes, could find no other frame of reference adequate to what the evidence showed. Timothy Ferguson was 15 years old. He had autism. He had motor impairments that made physical self-care more challenging than it would be for a neurotypical teenager his age. He was dependent on his mother, Shanda Vander Ark, and on the adults in his household in ways that his disability compounded and made more complete. He needed care. He needed accommodation. He needed the specific, patient, ongoing attentiveness that children with significant disabilities require. What he received instead was a systematic campaign of torture, starvation, deprivation, and cruelty that lasted for months and ended with his death on July 6, 2022, in the family home in Norton Shores, Muskegon County, Michigan. The practices that Shanda Vander Ark used against Timothy have been documented in court records that are, by any measure, among the most disturbing produced by any criminal proceeding in Michigan's recent history. He was subjected to ice baths, immersion in freezing water as a form of punishment. He was made to endure hot sauce applied to sensitive areas of his body. He was deprived of sleep, denied adequate food, and kept in conditions of physical deprivation that, over months, reduced his body to the state that investigators and medical examiners documented when they examined him after his death. The refrigerators in the home were reportedly kept locked to prevent him from accessing food. He was treated not as a child, not even as a person, but as a problem to be managed through suffering. Timothy had autism. His disability was used not as a reason to provide him with greater care and patience, which is what disability requires, but as a justification in Vander Ark's reported worldview for treating him as less than fully human. The specific way in which his neurodivergence was weaponized against him, the way his particular vulnerabilities were identified and then systematically targeted, is something that disability advocates who followed this case have spoken about extensively in the years since his death. Shanda Vander Ark was not alone in what she did to Timothy. Her adult son, who also lived in the home, was also charged in connection with the crimes. But this documentary's focus is Vander Ark, the mother, the primary caregiver, the person whose choices governed what happened inside that house. The investigation that followed Timothy's death, which was reported to authorities by people inside or connected to the household, produced a case file of extraordinary scope. Prosecutors built a case that documented not a moment of violence, but a sustained pattern of abuse lasting months, a pattern that was deliberate, calculated, and systematic. Timothy did not die from a single terrible event. He died from months of being slowly destroyed by the person who was supposed to love him most. Shanda Vander Ark was tried in Muskegon County in December of 2023. The trial lasted several days. Prosecutors presented the medical evidence, the testimony of investigators, and the documentation of what Timothy's life had been in the months before his death. The jury convicted Vander of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. On January 23, 2024, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 to 100 years on the child abuse conviction. At sentencing, the judge spoke at length about what Timothy Ferguson had endured. He spoke about the photographs. He spoke about the 69 pounds. He spoke about a 15-year-old boy with autism who had been systematically deprived of food, warmth, sleep, and dignity by his own mother in his own home over the course of months, and who had died from the accumulated weight of that deprivation. He spoke about the obligation of the court to impose a sentence adequate to the seriousness of what had been done. Life without parole. 50 to 100 additional years. Shanda Vander will never leave prison. But here is the thing about that sentence, and about every sentence handed down in every case in tonight's documentary. It does not give Timothy Ferguson back. It does not unexperience the ice baths, or the hunger, or the locked refrigerators, or the months of suffering in a home where he should have been safe. It does not reverse the 69 pounds, or undo the photographs that made a judge reach for the most extreme historical comparison he could find. It does not change what it means that a 15-year-old boy with autism was treated, by the person who brought him into the world, as something less than deserving of food. Shanda Vander is serving her sentence in a Michigan State Correctional Facility. Timothy Ferguson was 15 years old. He weighed 69 pounds. He deserved decades more of life, decades of support and care, and the kind of patient, attentive love that children with disabilities deserve. He deserved someone who would have fought for him. He did not get that someone. He got the opposite. And that is the truth, the clear, documented, fully verified, court-confirmed truth of what happened to Timothy Ferguson in Muskegon County, Michigan. Please like this video and subscribe to coldYtub. If Timothy's story reached you, share it. These children deserve to be remembered by everyone. 10 cases, 10 children, 10 failures of the most fundamental obligation that exists between a human being and the life they bring into the world. We began tonight in a Detroit apartment, with an eviction crew that opened a freezer and found the weight of years of silence inside it. We traveled across the state, to Iosco County and St. Clair County and Kent County and Wayne County and Wexford County and Macomb County and Muskegon County, and in every county, in every courtroom, in every medical examiner's report and law enforcement file and trial transcript, we found the same thing. Children who needed protection. Adults who provided the opposite. Systems that sometimes intervened and sometimes, too often, did not. What do we do with that? What do we do with the knowledge that Stephen Barry was 9 years old and his absence from school went unreported long enough for his body to be sealed in a freezer? What do we do with the knowledge that Zemar King told a caseworker his mother wanted to kill him and was left in her home for 6 more months? What do we do with Tatiana Fusari watching Mary Welch deteriorate for weeks and choosing prayer every single day over a phone call? What do we do with Timothy Ferguson's 69 pounds? We do not look away. That is what we do. We do not let these cases become the kind of thing that happens and then fades into the background noise of a busy world. We keep saying the names. We keep telling the stories. We keep asking the questions that the stories demand. Stephen Barry, Stoney and Blair, Sutton Marie Mosser, Matthew Maison, Mary Welch, Chas Allen, Lila Castle, Zemar King, Rebecca Park and her unborn child, Kyrie Starks, Timothy Ferguson. Their names deserve to outlast the darkness that surrounded their deaths. Their stories deserve to be told by people who refuse to stop paying attention. This is coldYtub. And we will keep telling these stories for as long as stories like these need to be told. If you made it to the end of this documentary, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Please like this video, leave a comment below with the name of the child whose story affected you the most, and subscribe to coldYtub so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These children deserve the world. The least we can do is make sure the world knows their names. Subscribe to coldYtub. Like, comment, share. These stories matter.